All right, so today's June 19th, 2022, and this is our Western Extinctionati meeting. And today we have a special guest, Jason, who's going to go over, he has an agenda for for our meeting today regarding, as you can see, civil disobedience, Erica Chenoweth, Jane McAklevy, and various other topics. Without further ado, I'll let Jason take over, and I'll be controlling the slides.
Great. And Mike, I've just sent you, if there's time and if people are interested, there's a couple of video segments that we can play. Yeah. So just for the agenda, I'm Jason. I'm someone who's been following Q since really the beginning, and had a few very good exchanges with Q. And I've been asked very kindly by Sophie and a few others to, would I lead a discussion on this topic, which has been a topic that the group has discussed and that Q was very interested in. And so from that point of view, I hope it's relevant and interesting. And I always open a meeting. I've got some experience in running meetings, and so if I'm leading something, I try and do the work of actually having an agenda. So this would be the agenda. And so if I'm leading something, I always take the practice of reviewing the agenda and having input on the agenda, so that if there's someone in the group who has an interest or something to cover that is not on the agenda, I want us to all hear about it at the start, and if possible, we'll integrate it, or we'll slate it for next time or whatever, but everyone should be heard. So this is the open forum section. So does anyone have any thoughts or anything they want to make sure we cover, or questions, or any feedback whatsoever?
Well,
and you can pipe up.
That's quite comprehensive, and I think it covers really a lot of things. So I don't feel like adding anything to this.
I'll make a few remarks about the agenda, just so you know how it's going to proceed. I thought I'd give some feedback on civil disobedience, elements of success, from what I have seen. So that would be my view based on looking at civil disobedience. And that won't take very long because they're very quick to summarize. The points that I make there will be interesting when we then review briefly the views of Erica Chenoweth, who's a professor and a highly trained political scientist who has studied revolutionary movements, resistance movements, both violent and nonviolent, and has come to some conclusions about that. The other person I propose that we look at is this very interesting labor organizer in American. She really began at age 16. Her name is Jane McAklevy. So we're going to look at her and get a different perspective on organizing. And the two are interesting because Erica Chenoweth is a pure academic. I don't think she's ever organized anything more than a panel conference at a academic, forum. And is an academic, highly respected and very, very competent, very thorough. I think very conscientious. But Jane McAklevy is the exact opposite. She began as a labor organizer starting at age 16 and did nothing but labor organizing. and behind the scenes. And she, in the last 12 years, has come out from behind the scenes and published and written about how to do what she did. So she is becoming an academic, but based on a very different trajectory. We'll take a very brief look at some movements today. XRIB, we're not going to really go into them, but just reflect on them. And deep adaptation. I thought I'd ask for people's input on transition towns, and then we can have some reflections and closing. This is a lot of work to do, and if we don't get through it, we'll slate it for next time. And if we're moving too slow and people want to move faster, you let me know. So let's go to the first slide. And everything I say, is kind of inspired by the kinds of things we discussed that Hugh's group discussed. So when what I'm going to talk about here is just civil disobedience, and I'm going to narrow it really to the civil rights movement in the U.S. as led by Martin Luther King and his associates, and the Indian independence movement as led by Gandhi. And I'm just going to make some observations. When I look at these, and I have studied them, I see that the subject position of the activists involved, the core groups of activists in the movement, is very strongly linked to the demands and the actions that the activists were making. In other words, they were the victimized party, or they were the aggrieved party, and then they achieved alliances with others who were not necessarily the aggrieved party, but they created alliances. They welcomed and opened alliances. So not everyone in the civil rights movement was African American. Only by marshaling lots of support from other ethnicities, whites and so forth, and making those connections, and up and down the class ladder. And similarly in India, Gandhi marshaled support in a multi-ethnic, multicultural society. He had to marshal support across that entire society, and the support of the British public and the British Empire, and so forth. So it began, though, with the subject position, and subject position is a theory term, of the activists being very strongly linked. And these movements, in my view, achieved an almost semiotic truth force. What do I mean by that? Semiotic is another theory term, but I mean, it means that the very meaning of the actions and the very identities of those acting were intimately connected. And the word truth force is a translation. It's one of the translations of Gandhi's term satyagraha, right? So it was the visible enemy. They had a visible enemy in terms of the long-standing laws and oppression of African Americans, the long-standing British Empire in the case of India, and all the differences in the ways in which British subjects, colonials, were treated versus actual peoples of India. And this was instantiated in both countries in legal means. Much of this internalized oppression was legal. It was instantiated in the law, and a lot of it was also extra legal. In other words, it was practices, it was behaviors, it was conduct, it was oppression that was extra legal but was tolerated, which makes it almost de facto, state sanctioned. And the civil disobedience actions in both of these movements, what I find is that they were extremely focused, if we think back. So they were focused on the very specific laws or conditions that were unjust. And they tended to be simple and proportionate. And so they were not sabotage, mostly, not criminal, and not beyond the unjust laws. They didn't go further than the unjust laws. And very simple examples will illustrate this. Instead, you are, if you're African American and you have establishments that are whites only, or segments of establishments, you don't block, most of their actions were not blocking traffic in front of such restaurants or places, or, tying themselves up in front of them, or preventing others from entering. All they did was go in and sit down at the whites only section of a lunch counter and put 50 cents on the counter and say, I would like a cup of coffee, please. And so the action in these cases, almost all, I'm not saying all of them, but most of the actions were exactly just the disobedience of the unjust law. And I would suggest that there's something there. There's something there we have to think about that was part of the strength of these. I think someone else needs to be on mute. Sitting in front of a bus. So the rear seats in the South were where black folk were relegated. So if you sat in front of the bus, you were told to move. If you refused, you were kicked off and arrested. But guess what? That marshaled a bus boycott in the South. And that bus boycott had a lot of effects. So again, these are economic actions, economic disruption that is strongly linked to the unjust laws being protested. So I would make a couple of observations at this point and open it up is you had that advantage, if you will, or you had that situation in social movement, protest movement that involved an aggrieved population, a very focused aggrieved population, or an aggrieved country or landmass or continent like India under British Empire. But that wasn't all. You had support. So these movements had support within the media. Both Martin Luther King and Gandhi had sympathetic journalists, had whole newspapers that were conscientious and felt they owed it to, as a matter of conscience, to report on this, especially on the nonviolent actions, and at least monitoring. So at minimum, you need monitoring of the event. If the nonviolent action occurs and there are no reporters who even expose it or record it, then you have a risk that it won't work. And in fact, most nonviolent protests that don't get recorded don't have any effect. You also had, in both of these cases, support from wealthy patrons and from political leaders. It's not like they faced no support. They had extremely wealthy people who were supporting, in Massachusetts, many of them wealthy Quakers were supporting Martin Luther King with donations. And Gandhi had substantial economic support coming from sources. It doesn't have to be millions, but there has to be some. And you also have to have actual political elected leaders or leaders in these countries who were supporting them. And in the case of Gandhi, you literally have, there were segments of the British public and segments of British government that thought it is inevitable and it is desirable that India achieve independence. We need to relieve ourselves of these colonial obligations. And there was a model already in existence for home rule, Australia and Canada. There were multiple different models and pathways and off-ramps for colonial domination already in the British Empire by 1947. So, there was, in other words, there were political supports for this. And you had to have national and global audiences that were sympathetic to the causes. And I stress this, it wasn't just a national audience. It has to be, for these movements to succeed, it was important that the world was watching. And then I have an observation, which it's surprising to me, but I haven't seen even these political scientists make this point. But any real strategist of power should, is that in both the cases of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, there were multiple violent groups and activists and movements at the same time carrying out actions for the same causes, making the nonviolent group look much the preferable path. And I don't know why it is that nobody's pointed this out, but I mean, if you go back in the US civil rights movement, you have at least two major splinters. One, Stokely Carmichael, was an open advocate for violent direct action and was personal friends with King and his leaders, but they had to separate. You had Malcolm X at the time advocating and verbalizing, I don't know about actions, but verbalizing for pro-violent actions. And you then had in the later years the Black Panthers, who were both did many things in community organizing to help communities that were completely nonviolent, and that was most of their activities. But they also did some displays of open carrying of shotguns and so forth in the state of California, and led to Ronald Reagan, the Republican, imposing the first major gun legislation, so that in reaction to Black folk actually carrying guns. So you can get gun legislation in America if Black folk would just start doing open carry again. I bet you we would get gun legislation really quickly, because we got it in California in the late 60s. And so you had these other movements, to the point where Martin Luther King is invited to the White House under Johnson. And Johnson literally has to tell King, you need to go out and create a crisis using your nonviolent methods. Create more of a crisis so I can move this Congress to pass the civil rights agenda. And so that's some of the history. Everything I say is documented. And so I'll just open up for discussion at this point. I presented enough here. What are people's thoughts on this?
I'm thinking that probably a diversity of types of resistance should be encouraged, because then there'd be a comparison between violent and non-violent ones. But you know, it's probably, I don't know how that would come about, but I guess a diversity in tactics would show some movements in a better light, and maybe goals can be achieved that way.
Yeah. I mean, if we move from this to thinking of the climate situation, there would need to be, for nonviolent, what my observation might suggest. I'm not saying this, but this is all just food for thought. I'm no expert here. I'm just someone who pays a little bit of attention. It might suggest that we would need all of these things, a very close relationship between the subject position of the demonstrators and the actions that they're requesting and the laws that they're breaking. Those were tightly coordinated and connected in the civil rights movement in the US and in Indian independence. The march to make salt, the famous march that Gandhi conducted to make salt. Salt is a commodity. Salt went up in price. If the Indian peoples make their own salt, they are taking back some economic control. The same with homespun cotton. And there were several other such things that affected the British economy. And so, and that enabled and empowered Indian peoples that were no longer having to buy cloth at almost British prices, finished cloth. So, those actions were all tightly connected. I guess what I'm saying here is, how could we imagine forms of protest or forms of direct action that would achieve something closer, something more closely tied in terms of the position of those doing the protesting, the nature of the action, and the demands in question? So those, just keep that in mind, and we'll go forward. Now let's go to the next slide, Mike, please.
I think
Jason, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is Zoo. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really fascinating. So let me know if I'm misrepresenting what you're saying, but I think what you're saying is that it was the nonviolent actions that, where the power structures, they elected to work with the nonviolent versions of some of these demonstrations. And if that's right, was it the violent demonstrations or the violent activists that compelled the power structure to do something? and then they simply moved to working with the nonviolent activists. I'm just wondering, is there a role for the violent activism in that it compels action on the part of the power structures, but it's the nonviolent activists that get sort of the recognition for having moved that forward?
Well,
And I'm sorry if I've misrepresented that.
No, not at all. You've got it. You've got the point that I'm trying to make. And if you look at every I mean, I don't know if any of you have families or histories of involved in decolonization, but I do directly. Let's take the South African context, which Hugh discussed on occasion, and he mentioned, I can't name which video, but he mentioned that there were the reason that we have the anti-apartheid movement succeeded is because Nelson Mandela and his movement represented the least violent outcome and the least violent group and narrative in South Africa. And only because there were actual groups calling for the death of every white person in South Africa, the slaughter of every white person in South Africa. One white person for every 100 Africans. You had those narratives there. Hugh talked about them. And he talked about many other factors that went into it. He even talked about how there were members of the South African government who saw this as inevitable, elected members, and there was a faction pushing for to tear down apartheid, probably step by step, slowly, a little bit at a time, but they weren't just all hardliners. And so you need this, in my view, history, the lesson of history, the lesson of every decolonization. If you look back, almost every decolonization results in the empire. Let's just take the British Empire. They work with and achieve and negotiate independence with, in most cases, the least violent and the least rhetorically and actually violent group, the least extreme group. Unfortunately, what often happens is that after the British leave, there's a civil war in which the extremist side says you settled for too little. And the side that has become the national government says, no, we didn't. We got the British out. We created a state, and you should join us. And you should stop your fighting and stop trying to say that we got a bad deal. Let's build a country. And that's why I would say, I haven't done the data, but let's just say more than half of all decolonizations are followed by some kind, within a few years, by a civil war. So it happened in Ireland, very, very painfully and famously, where Sophie lives. The War of Independence, which was celebrated, the centenary was celebrated last year. And this year, unfortunately, we have to mourn the Irish Civil War, which was in 1922, in which Irish went against Irish. And it was literally the pro-treaty side and the anti-treaty side. The British had settled with the least extreme group, which was actually led by one of the most effective terrorist leaders of all time, Michael Collins. But it was Collins's group who said, we're ready to stop fighting and form a government. And they became the Irish Free State. I'm just using examples that I know of. The Civil War ensued over the treaty. The treaty had settled for those northern counties to remain British. It had settled for an oath to the king. The Irish had to take an oath even after independence, and allow British ships up the Liffey, and several other things. And those were the terms of the treaty. The Irish had only had to become violent because they had tried every single type of cordial request for home rule, for a stair-step path towards some kind of home rule or independence. They initially didn't want total sovereignty. They weren't asking for that. Home rule would have been enough, but it was never granted. So they had to do what often happened. So that's an example of a violent overthrow that ultimately achieved Irish independence. But not without a lot of rough spots. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that the form that history takes in almost all cases, if we're talking about national liberation and decolonization, is there are a range of violent to nonviolent to violent, movements and activism. And in general, the colonial power will settle with the least extremist, least violent version of it. There may be exceptions to this, but if you go back and you look, you'll see that even if they settle with the most extreme branch of the activists, they will settle with the least extreme people in that. By definition, if you're making peace, that's who you're settling with. In the Middle East, we have the problem that the moment peacemakers try and settle, the more extreme entities assassinate them. So you've got the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Anytime there's a moderate Palestinian, he doesn't last very long, and the most moderate Israeli was assassinated by another Israeli more than a decade ago. So you have this problem, right? And if there's ever a peace agreement, you can bet that one side will accuse, each party will say you settled for too little, and there will be a civil war after that. I shouldn't say there will be, but there would be a chance of it. There would be a high likelihood of it, because these things don't settle out easily. This is just it's been the nature of the beast. We're talking about national liberation now. None of this as yet in our discussion approaches what you would do about the climate predicament. And I don't pretend to have, I'm not going to offer an answer on this. I'm just talking about the issue that has come up again and again with respect to XR and others, and in our group with respect to violent versus nonviolent functions and outcomes. And I'm sharing some, it's worthy of delving in. So unless there's more, if there's more feedback at this point, those were very good questions. Let's keep going, because we have, we want to get through this stuff, and we can then have questions afterwards. So we come to Erica Chenoweth. So why look at her? She is cited by leaders in XR, not once, not twice, but scores of times, as being the proof point of how their strategy has to work. So let's ask, who's Erica Chenoweth, and what did she say? She is the author, most notably with her collaborator, Maria Stephan, of a book in 2012 called Why Civil Resistance Works. Chenoweth came to her study from the industry of terrorist studies. So in the US and in Britain, you can go and get a PhD in terrorist studies at the finer universities, the international schools and finer universities. It's a very important discipline. She came to it thinking she was going to analyze, terror movements and violent revolutionary movements and develop theories about them and get her PhD. And then she went to a conference on nonviolent revolutions and became very interested in actually taking a data approach, which political scientists love. Let's publish a paper that shows percentage of people doing this versus doing that and outcomes. And so she took a data approach, and the data, she said, she analyzed more than 300 nonviolent campaigns occurring between 1900 and 2006, the year that she decided to start this study. And the criteria, probably lots of criteria, but the top criteria of her data analysis was that there were no weapons used, no harm to others was done by activists intentionally, only direct actions like boycotts, demonstrations, civil resistance, and these were conducted in an environment, the NV, nonviolent campaigns, occurred in an environment where there was lethal repression. In other words, the opposition was willing to use guns and kill people in all forms for these. She only looked at maximalist goals. This is her phrase. This would mean situations where what was being sought was the overthrow of a regime, a secession, a war of independence, a movement of independence, etc. A change of regime. And she distinguishes these from merely reformist campaigns. We'll get to that in a minute. The other criteria was the only things she admitted into the study were where there were already 1,000 participants in the organization, 1,000 participants in the activist group. That means that she didn't study 5 people chaining themselves to a tree to protest a tree being cut down. There had to be some sort of volume of participants, and that number was 1,000 documented participants. And so she says, I focused only on major maximalist campaigns. This is her phrase. It's very academic speak, but what she means is it was seeking a total regime change. So the end of a tyranny or a autocracy, the separation of one part of a state from another, or a secession movement, or an independence movement, like say in the Irish context or the Indian context. She would have counted the Indian context as a nonviolent and the Irish context as a violent. But of course, the Irish context succeeded, so did the Indian. But her findings, okay. Oh, I should mention before we go to the findings, that last bullet there, it says maximalist campaigns versus reformist. And guess what? Everything we've been talking about that has to do with civil rights or LGBTQ plus rights or Black Lives Matter, and she even says climate change. Erica Chenoweth characterizes, at least in her early lectures, she characterizes movements for climate or the environment as in the bucket of merely reformist campaigns. And so right there, anyone looking at her work should have said, well, and so that her data doesn't apply to that. She wasn't looking at those campaigns and how they did. But let's look at her findings. Roughly 50% of nonviolent movements as above that were for maximalist goals succeeded. Only 25% of armed movements for maximalist goals succeeded. And make of you what you will of these statistics, you'd have to see the data and look at the situations. It's just a data approach. So all the nuance, the kind of nuance that I just gave about the civil rights campaign and Gandhi's campaign, the nuance of the close connection between the types of actions, the almost poetic, semiotic connection of Gandhi's actions to what he was trying, what his movement was trying to do. The almost poetic, semiotic connection of what King did to the laws that he was trying to repeal. That nuance is not contained in Chenoweth's data. And I don't think she'd claim that it would. It's a data approach. It's one of these sociological approaches, right? Which treats everything as numbers. It has a certain value, but it has certain limitations of its value. What's most interesting is that Chenoweth has been, extending this research for the last 12 years, 10 years. And guess what her data finds on the activities? She has extended it beyond 2006. So as she is filled in with what are the violent and nonviolent movements since 2006, her data has trended down in effectiveness. And she recently made presentations, including the one that I recommended you look at, where she says all kinds of resistance are becoming less effective, and she can't really explain why. But we'll look at what she does say in the next slide. Feedback right so far. What, is this a surprise to anybody? Did anyone else look at who Chenoweth was?
I watched a video that you sent of her, and I thought, oh, you're obviously a spook. That's the first thing. I don't think anybody from Harvard could ever be credible on any level. And I just thought, oh, this is the thing that makes me feel more certain that XR is controlled opposition. As much as we all like Roger, I think he's the real deal. But yeah, I was just thinking, oh, this is, I think you used to talk about how, this idea of peaceful protest or whatever, non-violent thingy has been made very popular as a way of diffusing the possibility of some sort of physical interdiction of abuse. And I think it's all again, whether these people are entirely conscious or doing this deliberately, but I think this is all a ploy in some way in the part of the empire of civilization or whatever, which seems to only grow. So I don't know, and she was banging on about these color revolutions and the stuff in that happened in, say, Serbia. And I don't think these scenarios were clear cut. I don't think it was clear cut that Milosevic was a dictator and that there was, the overwhelming majority of the public wanted to topple Milosevic. And, the stuff that was going on in that area of the world was very complex. And there's lots of views from different, again, I'm in no position to present any scholarly or really particularly educated insights into that, but I just felt very suspicious of everything she seemed to be saying, and the fact that this is like one of the sources of XR's sort of philosophy of this non-violent thing just makes me, I don't know, it's all red flags. And again, maybe I'm just an anti-vax nutcase or something, so I don't really have an educated, scholarly answer to that. But it's just like my guts, which may be unreliable, said, oh, yeah, I don't know what this person's trying to say. I feel very suspicious of Chenoweth or Chenoweth or whatever.
No, not without reason. She's part of and embraced by, I don't say embraced, but is in the establishment of, terrorist studies, revolutionary studies at the top 5 or 10. She's welcomed into that group. She's a member of that group.
Nobody within that establishment can be trusted. If you look at like Chomsky banging on about, I owe a lot to the guy in terms of opening up a perspective on the world, but then banging on about if you don't vote for fucking Biden, your children will drown and whatever, insanity, which might have come out for whatever reason. But I can't see how anybody from one of these elite institutions is really a free thinker. Just to succeed
right.
or get to a position of authority in such an institution, you have to be willing to conform to so many layers of sort of social expectations within our civilization that it's like doctors. You have to get all those high marks in school and be a very obedient person to even get to a high status. And so I wonder if somebody like that's even capable of thinking. Actually, coming back to Chomsky, it makes me think of that interview where he challenged Andrew Marr from the BBC, and I'm sure everyone's seen that clip where he tells the guy, oh, obviously, if you had any kind of original thought, you wouldn't be allowed into this job, or words to that effect. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I'm sympathetic to what you say. The only thing I would say is, if Chomsky does believe that there's a existential difference between having, what you brought it up, having Biden versus Trump, or Biden versus whoever the Republicans select, then that's where it's coming from. He believes that probably at multiple levels that
it might be, but then that
he's not saying, in no way is he saying that Biden. I don't think anyone who's clueful thinks that Biden is some brilliant guy. He's the guy who settled. He's basically his view of economics and social justice issues is sort of like a centrist Republican of the Nixon era.
I'm sort of not so much reflecting on whether there's any difference between Biden and Trump, but just whether some sort of leading intellectual is saying that there is, means that they're not really, they haven't unplugged themselves from the matrix enough to even bother to say that. I can't give a scholarly.
But in essence, the biggest thing here is that Chenoweth and I'm not. It is not worth my time or any of our time to go through everything Chenoweth has written to see, has she ever made the observation that I made in the very first slide, that all of these movements, that has she sorted out which nonviolent, of her data set where she's crediting a nonviolent movement with success? I have one question. were there violent movements in the wings threatening much worse outcomes than the nonviolent movement?
Yeah,
If
that's
yes,
a good point.
If yes, then you need a third column in your data. You need a third column in your study, which is nonviolent movements where there was no substantial, can you document there was no substantial, much more violent narrative and activist group, even a small one. And violent, and she makes the point that violent groups are always smaller, or usually much smaller, because the advantage, I mean, she makes it the other way. The advantage of a nonviolent group is it will attract more people.
Yeah, because the violent groups have got more balls and, you know, are more of a rare
the violent groups
creature,
have to have weapons. They have to have these resources. They have to have some level of training, and they have to stay out of the reach of the police and military. Whereas the nonviolent people can be everybody. And, you know, you have interesting things, you know, we'll go further into it in a minute, but, you know, there are many other tactics of nonviolent that XR never seems to have used. I mean, it raises a ton of questions, is that, and Nafiz Ahmed and others have made points that they have not, that Chenoweth's work is Chenoweth's work. It's valid in of what it is. It has, to my mind, there's almost nothing you can draw from Chenoweth's work that would help XR. I mean, they've drawn the wrong things. They've attributed wrong things to it. But let's go a little further, because I want to get through this. So Chenoweth's concepts, this page of concepts here, she says it's simple. The goal is to reduce the pillars of support for the regime. And pillars of support is a political, you know, it's a political analyst phrase. So you reduce the pillars of support for the regime through nonviolent direct action. She comes up, she cites a theory. There is a theory, so that you all know where this shit comes from. It is called the momentum theory in political science. Believe it or not, you can get a PhD in this stuff. It is the number of people times the number of events in the previous 7-day period. I was floored when they said that that's their metric. So nonviolent campaigns, this is out of order. The 3.5% is all you need to have success. That's Chenoweth's phrase. And she says it's a revision. It turns out things are even better than the earlier rule that we had in political revolution studies, which was the 5% rule, which is from a scholar named Mark Lickbach from 1995. No government, quote, can survive mobilization of 5% of its citizens engaging in active collective action against the state. So political scientists had these rules for more than 20 years of what percentage, you know, do you need, and what, you know, as we look at, and as they look back at political revolutionary movements, what percentage of people do you need in the street, right? So that's where that comes from. And we're going to talk more about 3.5% or 5% as we go further. The resistance, what this last bullet is, concentration versus dispersion, commission. Boy, there's some bad noise out there. What is that? Who's using a saw? Someone is using a saw. Hello? All right. So, briefly, concentration versus dispersion, commission versus omission. So this simply means, these are terms. If you have everybody in a square, that's concentration, you know, in a plaza, in Tiananmen Square. If you have everybody carrying out actions all over the country, that's dispersion. If you have people committing an act like a sit-in or, you know, blocking traffic or going down to make salt in the sea, that's a commission. If you have people simply not turning up to work or not completing a government form or not doing something, that's omission. Or boycotts, I guess that's omission. One of the most interesting things that I had forgotten about is in both Argentina and I think in Chile, there is a tradition of what's called the cacerolia, which is where throughout the city, people will open their windows, and every member of the family will take the loudest and biggest pots and pans that they have. They will stuff their ears with cotton or paper, and they will beat the pans as loud as they can every night in their own homes, and they won't be visible. Sometimes they're visible from their balconies, but if they think the police are on the street, of course they stay away from their balcony. They just have the open window with the lights out, and everyone who is opposed to the government action or who is signaling their support, they do this. And Going South is observed, Sawmill Sunday. So these are actions, and Chenoweth makes the point that these actions are very hard for the police. They are completely rendered powerless. They cannot silence this, and you can measure the decibels as in different neighborhoods as to how it's literally voting with a popular vote by acclamation for or against whatever the issue is. So I think that stuff is marvelous, right? I don't know that the XR ever thought of that. I mean, I spent a few hours on this. If I were going to be leading a movement and asking people to put their lives in danger, I would do a fuckload more research on what kinds of things work and what kinds of things don't before I would be asking people to glue themselves to subway cars or put themselves out on the auto route. I mean, there's a whole lot of irresponsibility going on here among many other problems. So let's go to the next slide. So Chenoweth says, in reference to both violent and nonviolent movements losing their effectiveness, she goes through these reasons. And of course, there's probably others. Which is autocratic adaptation. So what does that mean? That means the regimes are learning how to counter nonviolent and violent regime repression, activism. Digital activism. So obviously use of social media, the presence of everyone has a smartphone, everyone can see everything can be geolocated, all of this. That creates strengths in these kinds of movements, both kinds of movements, but also weaknesses. You can be tracked, countermeasures can be launched, you can be detected, etc. You can have a government psyop marshal a whole counter-revolutionary, and that's the next item. So counter-mobilization, counter-revolution is just as enabled by digital activism as the revolution itself. She also sees a problem as the rise of illiberal movements. I mean, we have a populist rising in the US, in Britain, and other countries, in Hungary and other countries, of grassroots racism, grassroots fascism, grassroots desire for autocracy. They want their autocrat to punish whoever, to punish the scapegoat that they have, whether it's black folk or gay folk or trans folk or immigrant folk or folk with more melanin in their skin or what the fuck ever. There are illiberal movements that are arising, and so that's kind of new. Well, it's new since the last time it happened, which was in Germany in the 1930s and in Italy, and it can be illiberal and not genocidal, right? So Mussolini was not a genocidal person, and neither was Franco. They were murderous, but only Hitler had this Jones, this completely racial notion. I'm not saying there wasn't racial elements to Mussolini or Franco or to many other fascisms, but fascism is not always genocidal, and it's important to remember that fascism is wildly successful. It is not, people focus on Hitler, but fascism existed and still exists in Latin America. It was the dominant mode of political control in Latin America until really the 2000s, and but it may be going back. So fascism can be very successful. I mean, fascism in Spain and Portugal did not end with war or the death or the assassination of the fascists. They died a natural death. Franco and what was his name in Portugal? I forget his name. But Rodriguez. Anyway, the other Portugal had a fascist leader as well.
Salazar.
And Salazar, right? And you can, fascism is actually wildly successful if you look at it. Only if you make the mistakes that Hitler made of, waging war on very much larger countries who had more oil. What a fool! I mean, by any military standard, he was insane and going to lose. So, vision and strategy. So Chenoweth, going on with the slides here, vision and strategy need to be fully fledged before planning tactics or reacting to the opposition. And she says we need to recover what Gandhi called the truth force. So what I labeled right at the beginning as truth force is this very close poetic tie between the action, the subject position of the aggrieved party, their actions, their demands, their conduct, and I would say that if you can achieve that, and if you have a much more violent group in the wings, you might have a formula for success. But that's not Chenoweth, that's Jason talking. And I don't see that happening in XR or anything like that. So let's go to the next slide. I'm actually not going to go through this. You can read it. This is going deep on that first item of the previous slide. What are the autocratic adaptations to both violent and nonviolent resistance in the last 20 years? And many of these are from a very old playbook, but Chenoweth has updated them here. Sorry. And so you can take a look at those. While you're reading that, I'm going to catch up on the chat because I haven't been able to follow the chat. Yeah, going south, I like your comment. Didn't have to force the British out. So look, going to this, we've seen all of these. We've talked about this: counter mobilization, agent provocateurs, the use of plainclothes police, contractors, mercenaries, death squads, thugs, gangs, proxies. So it doesn't have to be the government forces with their uniforms. It could be some strange other force, which is a government force, it's just not labeled. It's control of the brand in essence. The government's actually using terror tactics, using pseudo-legitimate laws or passing new terrorism laws, as is happening in Britain as we speak, labeling disruption of transit by nonviolent means a form of terror. That's rich, but it's happening. All right, let's go to the next. And now we come to Jane McAlevey, almost the same age. I don't know what the age are. It'd be interesting. What is the age of McAlevey and Chenoweth? I think Chenoweth might be slightly younger. So Jane started when she was 16 in school, and then went to college in SUNY, State University of New York, and very quickly rose to be a student union president. And as such, the president of the student union for all of the state universities of New York, which is the largest state university system after California. She is on the board. She is by de facto, at that time, the head of the state student union elected by the students would be on some governing board of the State University of New York system. And she'd had many petitions and activism to get there, including preventing the increases of tuition and all sorts of other interests of the students. And she describes a very interesting sort of event around South African disinvestment, divestment for apartheid. So some of you who were in the States or may know, or in Britain and other countries, there were divestment movements internationally that played a role. I don't claim that they played the role, but they played a role in putting pressure on the South African apartheid government. And McAlevey led the anti-apartheid divestment movement in the State University of New York system. And I'm going to focus here just on a little bit of direct action that she did. She knew she'd be, this is like the 5th or 7th time that she was testifying and appealing to the board of the state university to make the decision to divest. All she's asking, all they're asking, all we were asking at that time is, go ahead and invest in capitalist companies. Just don't invest in any of the industries or companies that make money in South Africa. How freaking difficult is that? But it would be caving to the demands of snot-nosed students to do that. It would be caving into lefty demands. It would be letting students dictate our foreign policy, etc. So there was great resistance in the 80s and 90s to doing this. It was really in the 80s. And but she led this. And she knew, I mean, this is how tactical she is. She knew that when she filed the final petition, which she knew she would lose, she knew that the board, she was appealing to the board to vote, and she knew she didn't have the votes. So the first thing is Jane McAlevey never goes into a situation without knowing whether she has the votes. She knew she wouldn't have the votes. She knew that she could bring in, she had one or more members of the committee, of the board, that were sympathetic enough to prevent her microphone from being cut off. In other words, the right-wing elements of the board would say, you're done, you've had your 10 minutes or your 5 minutes, or because usually there's these Robert's Rules of Orders for these kinds of democratic institutions. You're allowed 5 minutes maximum to make your case, and then you can be shut down. So she knew she would have one or more members of the board allow her to make her full case, bring witnesses, etc., bring support. And she brought members of the ANC, the African National Congress, American representatives of it, in to make their case. Okay, so you have mostly the least violent group in South Africa advocating for anti-apartheid, members being brought in by Jane McAlevey in 1984. She's only 19 or 20, and she brings them in, and she still knows she's going to lose, but she's ready with a strategy. She and her team have a strategy where they're in the same building where the management office for the investment funds of the State University of New York system are conducted. And so she knew that, and she knew that she excused herself from the meeting temporarily, and she and her team went into the investment office and told the people in there that they were going to occupy the investment office and they were going to close the doors. And when they closed the doors, no one would be able to get out. Every single staff member left. They didn't threaten them. They didn't break anything. They didn't vandalize those offices. They did the most important thing they could, which was to copy any documentation they found about the portfolio of the investments, so that she copied exactly what companies they were invested in that have connections with South Africa. And that information was gold. And the building was surrounded by police, and eventually they were brought out and all arrested. And they were had a very strong hard-on for Jane. She was one of 5 who were tried, and she was offered a plea, which is if she promised to never do this kind of action again, the charges would be dismissed. And she said, I'm sorry, but I can't promise that. So she went to jail and was eventually released because they, at that time, it was under a liberal governor. It was Mario Cuomo in New York. I mean, it couldn't be the case that this 20-year-old would stay in prison for 4 years, because she was active in prison. She is a force. And so she was released after a time. But what a direct action, right? What a plan. I mean, you got to hand it to her. What she had is again, support or sympathy from some in the media. She had support from leaders on the inside. She had a focused agenda, and the demands were connected to the specific issues. They were not vague. They couldn't be made to even seem vague. If the demands were met, they would create an obviously substantive change aligned with the stated goals and values of those making the demands. That's another criteria. I find that her demands were very connected to the specific injustice. The demand was divest from South Africa. The system there is unjust. It's apartheid. You shouldn't be investing. The State University of New York, the tuition and the tax monies